Testing. Hello. Okay. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for being here on a special occasion. We have yet another installment in our lecture series here in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Macau. And today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Danielle Macbeth, who has, like so many other speakers, traveled a great distance to be here. So we're really, really honored and grateful that you've taken the time, undergone all the traveling to be here with us. Professor Macbeth is the T. Wistar Brown Professor of Philosophy at Haverford College in the United States. She's the author of books like Frege's Logic, published with Harvard University Press in 2005, and more recently, Realizing Reason, A Narrative of Truth and Knowing, published with Oxford University Press in 2014. Alongside these works, she's published numerous essays in areas like philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, philosophy of mathematics, the history of philosophy. Today, Professor Macbeth is going to present to us a talk titled Art as Inquiry, the Path of Chinese Lyric Aesthetic. So venturing into some newer waters. As usual, Professor Macbeth will speak for anywhere between 50 to 60 minutes, and then we will have anywhere between 30 to 40 minutes of Q&A. So with that, I'm going to ask us to all welcome our speaker with a round of applause. And I'll hand things over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And thank you everyone for being here, and also people on Zoom. Yes, this is new work for me. I've been working on it for quite a while, but I'm only now feeling that I'm sufficiently far along in it that I am sharing it with people. So I'm particularly interested in getting a response. Any thoughts, questions about the material? This is just one piece of a much larger project, and I really want to emphasize it's also just one strand in the rich tapestry of traditional Chinese thought. There's so much, and I'm just looking at one piece, but I think it's a piece that is quite illuminating. So beginning with music, through the emergence of lyric poetry, and culminating in the literati brush and ink landscapes of the Southern song, something happened, something Cao Yukong calls Chinese lyric aesthetic. My interest is in the nature and character of this happening. What I will suggest is that the Chinese lyric aesthetic tradition is a tradition of inquiry into how things are, in particular, into the fundamental structure of meaning as it shapes our lived world. Traditional Chinese language, culture, and thought are obviously and dramatically different from Indo-European language, culture, and thought. But how exactly? The answer, I assume here, takes its orientation from an idea not hitherto explored. That in order to understand the broadest contours of language, culture, and thought, we need to recognize two essentially different ways of speaking and hearing speech, ways that are grounded in the peculiarity of speaking as an action. For obviously speaking is an action, as in its way, listening to or hearing talk is. Speaking is something one does. But speaking is also utterly unique among actions, insofar as it is a doing with repeatable content. It is a doing with words. Because it is, one can, on any given occasion of speaking, take either of two very different orientations toward the act. Supposing first that the act and content of speaking are inseparable, as they are in, say, a dance that one dances, one attends first and foremost to the speaker, the agent in so acting. Alternatively, supposing that the content is wholly separable from the act, as, for instance, something one makes, a loaf of bread, say, is separate from the act of making it, one attends instead to the content, the words that are spoken, what is said in speaking, conceived as a separable product. All the evidence suggests that Chinese speakers are oriented in speaking and hearing the first way, supposing that the act of the speaker and the content of that act to be inextricably combined. Chinese speakers and hearers focus on the contentful act, the saying, as an agent's doing. Indo-European speakers instead focus on the content, assumed to be wholly separable from the agent's act. And in both cases, speakers are oriented as they are, not merely on this or that occasion, as anyone might be, but in general, as the core of an overall understanding of what speakers and hearers are doing in speaking and hearing. Although any of us can take either orientation, and do take now this one, now that, as we move through our days, our weeks, our lives, there are nonetheless profound cultural differences in which of the two orientations is the default assumption constitutive of the character of the language one speaks and of one's overall understanding of things. Again, Chinese language, culture, and thought is speaker-focused. In speaking and hearing, the focus is on the agent and act of speaking, the content of which is assumed to be exhausted in the act, inseparable and unrepeatable. The act of speaking on the speaker-focused model is a form of self-expression, or purported self-expression, a sharing of oneself with another, though not, as on the content-focused model that characterizes Indo-European languages, in the form of a report of how things are in one's inner private space. To express oneself in the sense intended is to make manifest, often as much to oneself as to another, what is otherwise only latent. It is to bring to expression, to give voice to one's emotions and feelings, one's interests and plans, one's attitudes and beliefs, or at least what are presented as such. It ought not to surprise us then that Chinese is a high context language requiring close attention, not only to the words uttered, but also to the gestures, postures, and facial expressions of the speaker, and even to what is not said, both in absolute terms and relative to other word choices that might have been made. Nor, for the same reason, should it surprise us that whereas a content-focused Indo-European language, such as English, contains a very wide variety of tools for putting thoughts, paradigmatically thoughts about what is the case, into words, Chinese, a speaker-focused language, contains relatively few such resources. As a result, understanding utterances in Chinese is essentially holistic. One must begin with the whole utterance, the words as they are used in the particular sentence, in the particular context of use, if one is to grasp what is expressed. In Chinese, the medium of the message is not merely the words that are spoken, but the whole of the speaker's act, the saying, and all it involves and entails. Words in such a language do not function as tools, special purpose instruments with which to construct messages that can be understood independent of the speaking of them, as is the case in an Indo-European language. Rather, words are like materials, stuffs out of which to create new meanings that are, to a greater or lesser extent, unique to the act of speaking in which they are involved. In such a case, it is the facility not merely with the words of the language, but with the whole of the culture, its history, literature, and practice, even its body language, that determines not only how well a speaker is able to fashion a face for a hearer, but also the skill with which a hearer is able to discern what is thereby revealed. If one is to speak well and hear well in such a culture, one must be educated. To be oriented in speaking and hearing to speakers and speaking rather than to what is spoken has implications as well for one's understanding of reality and one's conception of the character of one's knowledge of reality. In a culture in which the basic default orientation in speech is to the speaker speaking over the content spoken, one's primary and paradigmatic cognitive relation is that of understanding another person, another self like oneself. And one largely defaults to such understanding in one's cognitive involvements with other things, insofar as those things, living and non-living, are likewise conceived as agents, as doing things, and in so doing, as expressing themselves. The overall conception, then, is of a dynamic, vital whole of expressive agents interacting in discoverable ways, a whole of which we, expressive agents that we are ineluctably a part. We need also to attend to the more local context of lyric aesthetic, that provided by the legacy of Confucius and Zhuangzi. Specifically, their respective understandings of what is involved in what Du Wei-min has described as learning to be human. We are born mere animals with animal needs and desires, animal powers and limitations, and become human, if only in a preliminary or minimal sense, through our acculturation into a socially evolved language and form of life, through our becoming, each of us, one of us, a member of some actual human community. What early Chinese thinkers, Confucius, Zhuangzi, and others saw is that such an acculturation is only a beginning. Fully to realize one's humanity requires a further process of self-actualization, of transformative growth that can be undertaken only by oneself and for oneself. One must, each for oneself, learn to be human, and must do because as a reflective, acculturated animal, one is inevitably divided against oneself, divided between what we do and what one's own desires and inclinations motivate one to do, between what we take to be so and what by one's own lights appear to be so. It is this tension that catalyzes, at least for some, a course of reflection, the goal of which is to resolve the difficulty. It is such people who cannot stop asking, what to do, that Confucius takes as his students. The question, what to do, arises because although neither one's desires nor societal expectations are problematic in themselves, each is put into question by the other. As social norms reveal, one's desires are in themselves mere brute inclinations without intrinsic value or normative force. As one's desires reveal, societal norms need not be intrinsically motivating, unquestionably valuable to one. And this creates a problem because the human agent, self-conscious and reflective as it is, needs to be able to recognize itself in its actions. Such an agent needs a reason to do as it does, that is, its own. So far, however, any putative reason is either question begging, why should I do what is socially expected? Or empty, my desires, mere brute inclinations. What is one to do? The question is not about one's actions here and now, but about one's agency, the form properly human agency needs to take. It is the problem of identifying reasons for action that at once move one to act and provide one a reason to act, the one by being the other. In ancient China, the problem was conceptualized as that of finding the right perspective from which to view a situation, the perspective from which properly motivating reasons become apparent to the agent. For Confucius, the perspective that is wanted is that of a judge tasked with mediating between two perspectives, the interests, feelings, and attitudes, both of oneself and of another. Imagine, for example, that you are talking or otherwise engaging with another person. Each of you has your own perspective, your own projects, your own feelings, your own values and ideas. Suppose further that these projects, feelings, values, and ideas are such as to generate a conflict of some sort. For example, this. You are angry with the other for having acted in a certain way in particular circumstance, while the other is unrepentant, perhaps even pleased to have so acted. The task, as Confucius conceives it, is to bring the beliefs and feelings of both parties into equilibrium so as to achieve or restore harmony between the agents involved. It is for one to play judge for both, to take a new, higher perspective that embraces both oneself and the other self, and in this precise sense, a perspective that regards the interests of the other as one's own, that is, as of equal importance or significance. The conflict is to be resolved by one's coming to recognize what it is best for one to do in the situation as a whole, as involving both of us, where what is best is to restore harmony in a maximally rich sense, in a harmony that emerges organically out of the interaction and constitutively involves the nurturing and flourishing of both parties to the dispute. We often know how to do this. We do it, for example, in our thoughtful and engaged care of our children. Frustrated and exhausted though they may be, parents rise above their own immediate feelings to attend to the needs of the child. And ideally, they do so in a way that resolves the immediate problem, while at the same time taking a step towards the child's ultimately achieving self-understanding and self-mastery. To learn to be human on this Confucian view is to learn to occupy such a perspective as who one most fundamentally is in all one's relations and interactions with others. It is to transcend one's own idiosyncratic perspective, not by coming to be without any perspective at all, as if what is known in the West as the God's eye view, the view from nowhere, were possible, which it's not, but by coming to occupy a perspective from which to understand all one's engagements as irreducibly engagements of two or more selves in communion. Grounded in the care we naturally have for those closest to us, our parents and our children, our siblings and our friends, such thoughtful and impartial harmonizing care is then extended outward to embrace ultimately all that is, all people and all things, all the doings of the myriad entities that make up the world in which we live. Unfortunately, as the very different perspective of Mozi and his followers revealed, the Confucian perspective turns out to be not high enough. No matter from what perspective one views a situation, a conflict, or a question, there will inevitably be another conflicting perspective, another vantage point from which to weigh the considerations differently. What to do? The question had yet to receive a satisfactory answer. As Confucius was, Zhuangzi was concerned to understand what human life is and can be. Unlike Confucius, Zhuangzi could not style himself a teacher. What would he teach, given that any judgment about how things are and what is needed is only from one perspective, opposed to which there is always inevitably another? Instead, Zhuangzi tells stories, sometimes stories involving agents with very different perspectives, but also often stories about people who are especially skilled at something. Whereas the Confucian seeks to harmonize all reality, to realize the flourishing of all things, beginning with the realization of harmony both within oneself and between oneself and another, the Zhuangzi instead seeks a sympathetic resonance attunement with reality as it is. The task is to be as a mirror, the reflector of heaven and earth, the mirror of the myriad things. Where Confucius seeks a higher perspective from which to adjudicate conflicts and restore harmony, Zhuangzi seeks what he thinks of as the perspective of heaven, a perspective from which one takes in things as they are, but does not judge. In all one does, one mirrors things as one's experience reveals them to be, adding nothing. Mirroring is, of course, a common trope for knowing. It is such a trope both in the Chinese tradition and in the Indo-European tradition. The notion of a mirror is nonetheless essentially different in the two cases. For the Indo-European thinker, focused on the content of speaking as something separate from the act, one's mirroring some aspect of reality is conceived as essentially passive, a state of a knower. Mirrors, as conceived by Chinese thinkers, are instead essentially active. To mirror is to respond to the call of things, to resonate with them, as, for example, the string of a zither comes to resonate, vibrate with the vibrating string of another zither. For Zhuangzi, actively to mirror things in all one does, to respond in this way to their call, is to be as one with the ever-changing patterns of the cosmos, to realize in one's doings one's communion with all reality, and in so doing, to realize oneself as fully human. Such active mirroring, knowing, is furthermore conceived to be from the heart, which is wholly to be expected if, grounded in a speaker-focused conception of utterance, the paradigm of knowing is knowing the other with whom one speaks, knowing persons. Knowing, in such a case, is an active, essentially engaged, committed, and caring involvement with another that is most immediately manifested in one's involved activities with the other. It is a knowing that constitutively involves emotions. It is from the heart, just as the Chinese character for mind suggests. And as Zhuangzi saw, the capacity for such knowledge requires a long course of training, study, and practice, the aim of which is to still one's heart so as to experience and so respond to things as they actually are, not as one might wish them to be or has been acculturated to experience them. To have become an active mirror and thereby a knower of things as they are is to discern the true significance of things for one, the emotional coloring, the value they have in relation to one. It is this idea of actively mirroring things as they are in their emotional coloring in relation to a knower that will be taken up and transformed in the practice of lyric aesthetic. So that was all background. Lyric aesthetic begins with music. And it does so because it is in one's experience of music that one first learns to savor the experience as an experience, something that is made possible in turn by the fact that music expresses and evokes emotions with an immediacy and an intensity unrivaled by other art forms. Listening to music, the right sort of music, one learns to linger, self-consciously to attend to the sound of the music, to find intrinsic meaning and value in it. Music is, in this way, transformative. It is also a mode of communication and communion between people, whether as performed or as experienced through the performance of another. But music is both articulate and ephemeral. Like speaking, musical performance leaves no trace. It is ephemeral. Unlike speaking, music is also inarticulate. While music opens one up to a new way of experiencing, to aesthetic experience. It is in the millennia-long evolution of poetry, from the earliest songs to the lyric of the Tang, that there emerges a language adequate to the task of speaking the emotion that lives in music. In the refined enjoyment that is one's aesthetic experience of music, one finds oneself with a new sort of detached engagement, a self-conscious immersion in one's experience of oneself in the world. What one is and knows oneself to be doing is experiencing oneself as, in the first instance, hearing the music. And one can equally come to be and to know oneself to be engaged in this way as one is doing something else, not listening to music, but say, climbing a mountain, or gazing at the moon, or parting with a friend or lover. One's emotional involvement in things has become something about which one might try to write, about which one can write, given the poetic language that comes to be fully realized in the Tang. Chinese lyric poetry reached its acme in the Tang, in regulated verse of 4 to 8 lines of 5 or 7 characters. As we can think of it, we start with a template, a grid, 5 across by 8 down, say, with a variety of constraints on the characters, words that can occupy the places in that grid. In the case of pentasyllabic 8-line regulated verse, for example, the 8 lines form 2 quatrains of 2 couplets each, the second and third of which must be parallel, both in thematic category and in parts of speech. The first couplet can be parallel. The last must not be. There's a pause after the second word in each line and another after either the third or the fourth. The even lines must rhyme and have the same rhyme throughout. The tone of the rhyming words is level. So-called empty words, prepositions, conjunctions, particles, and the like are to be avoided, as are all pronouns. No word may be repeated. And there are constraints as well on the content, how the poem is organized and its theme developed. Overall, the task is to fill in the squares of the grid with characters, words, in a way that satisfies all the constraints and, ideally, yields something of aesthetic value. So described, the task seems overwhelming, not to say a little perverse. The constraints seem draconian, and yet the poet freely acquiesces to them, because the constraints are in fact a condition of the peculiar aesthetic value of the poetry. The constraints are the means and medium of the form of expression that is sought. They provide the grammar of the poetic language within which alone the poet is able to express their poetic vision. Speaking reality as it shows up in one's refined emotional engagement is obviously no part of what language is or could have been originally called on to do. Nevertheless, a language such as Chinese can provide the basis for the emergence of a properly poetic language within which to speak the reality revealed in one's emotional engagements. And it can do because its words function as a material in the expression of meaning rather than as a tool for the construction of pictures. With its extraordinary restrictions on form and content, Chinese lyric poetry focuses a reader's attention on even the subtlest aspects of the meanings of characters, on tensions and resolutions that characters placed as they are within the grid demanded by the genre afford. The constraints serve in particular to undercut referential aspects of words, highlighting thereby their power to express the purely sensory and affective. And much as one is transformed through the acquisition of any language at all, so one can be transformed by learning to write and to read the poetic language of Chinese lyric poets. One can come to inhabit the world in a new way, self-consciously to experience things as themselves awash with emotional meaning and significance, as themselves expressing the sadness or joy or tranquility one feels. One comes to experience the emotion expressed not as something caused in one by the object, but as something communicated to one by the object, much as the vibrations of one string can be thought to be communicated to another. The poet resonates with affective happenings in the world and molds into articulate expression what the scene communicates, in this way giving words a voice to what the scene wordlessly conveys. The poem speaks the scene, its significance for one in a way that anyone might hear. And insofar as we can, any of us come through the poem to experience that bit of reality of which it speaks, we discover that the reality of which it speaks is somehow deeply akin to the human. The aesthetic practice that culminates in the poetry of the Tang in this way realizes the world as affectively knowable and known, things as they are, each in its living reality, its inner nature, its self-sowing. Ziran. What such poetry cannot do is thematize this new relationship. As music first teaches one to linger, to savor one's emotional experience of things, but cannot reveal a world charged with significance and value, so poetry, even lyric poetry, although it can reveal the emotional coloring, the meaning and significance there is in things, cannot explore what is revealed thereby to be common, what underlies and makes possible one's resonant, knowing engagement with things. The poet has fathomed self and other in their inner nature and essential connection. The project now is to explore what this is that has been revealed, a project taken up already in the age of profound learning and fully manifested, I will suggest, in brush and ink, mountain and water, writing paintings of the Southern song. Lyric poetry reveals the emotional coloring of things, ways things can and do matter to us, what they mean to us. What lyric poetry cannot do is address that in virtue of which one is in such a relationship with things, the underlying that enables what lyric poetry reveals. This is the task of lyric painting, which explains in large part why such painting is considered a form of writing. What is of interest is not the look of things, but their inner natures, the nature that is expressed also in characters through brush strokes and ink. But the writing is not merely writing any more than calligraphy is. It is not merely writing insofar as one is not concerned, as one is in poetry, with this or that bit of reality. The concern is with significance as the medium within which things are alive to us in lyric experience, and implicitly in all aspects of our lives. As in calligraphy, lyric painting uses brushstrokes to exhibit meaning. The meaning is, however, no particular meaning. It is meaning as such, as indicated already by the ostensible subject matter of such paintings, mountain and water. For while in one obvious way, a painting of a landscape is just as particular as a painting of, say, bamboo stalks, just as particular as a poem about some bit of landscape, in a literary landscape, mountain and water are not the topic, but instead serve as a way of concerning oneself with all reality. The mountain, timelessly enduring and monumentally solid as heaven, yang, and water, endlessly vital and life-giving, yin. A brush and ink rendering of mountain and water has in this way the potential, at least, to express the nature and structure of meaning itself, the inner vitality, not of this or that bit of reality, but of reality itself. We find already in Zhuangzi an image not only of the resonance of one vibrating string with another, but also of total resonance, the resonance of a plucked string with all other strings, whatever their tuning. So, I suggest, in the writing painting of mountain and water, there is, or at least can be, total resonance, not merely an image of a thing in its nature, but a kind of image of the condition of possibility of there being any images, meanings, or resonances at all. This is what the lyric aesthetic this is what lyric aesthetic required after the full and adequate development of lyric poetry. And it is what, as I will suggest, lyric landscape paintings, some of them, deliver. In the hands of adept, such paintings write the meaning beyond meaning, that in virtue of which there is any meaning at all. The question is, how? How might one write the meaning beyond meaning in a painting? Lyric painting is, again, conceived as a form of writing. One does not paint literati paintings, but writes them. And not only that, one writes them using brushstroke and ink techniques of the calligrapher in particular. As, after years of training, practice, and study, the calligrapher does, the scholar painter, through years of training, practice, and study, uses brush and ink to express themselves in the endlessly subtle modulations of brushstroke and ink. And just as the calligrapher does, the literatus needs utterly to still their mind before putting brush to silk, so that the complex riches of one's own true inner nature might be made manifest. The art of calligraphy enables one in this way to write without writing, indeed to write beyond writing, precisely in the sense that is needed in lyric aesthetic. Calligraphy writes the brushstrokes, the characters, without which there is no writing at all, at least in the form writing takes in Chinese, without writing anything at all. As is well known, the contents of the characters, their meanings, are irrelevant in calligraphy. In landscape, similarly, what brushstrokes write over and above the things, mountain and water, with which it is ostensibly concerned, is space itself, the space within which there is anything to write or paint at all. Already Wang Wei, Tang artist and founder of the Southern School, tells us that a rock should be shown on three sides. Guo Xi in the 11th century returns to the point, noting that there are three perspectives or distances of mountains in a landscape. And the idea is picked up yet again in the 17th century work, The Mustard Seed Garden Manual. In the opening section of the Book of Rocks, the section concerned with indicating the three faces of a rock. As Sima Mai suggests, this idea of the three faces of a rock, or I would add, the three distances of mountains, serves as an image to symbolize or stand in for the one, the Tao. As C says, the one can only be expressed through the three. The three distances, three faces or facets of mountains in a literati mountain and water writing painting, write in this way the Tao itself, the source and sustenance of all things, all meaning, and all significance. It is often remarked that whereas a Western perspective painting is of a scene as seen through a window or an open door by a stationary observer, a song landscape instead suggests the unlimited space of nature, as though one had stepped through that window or open door into the scene. as we might think of it, where the aim of early modern European thinkers such as Descartes and of Western landscape painters, say John Constable, was to quantify even the qualitative, to mathematize all of nature. Chinese scholar painters were qualifying even the quantitative, even the measurable distances of space. The landscape of a Chinese painting is not a space to be measured, but a place to be inhabited, a place within which one might be at home. And this works, I propose, because what the articulation of space in a landscape means, what it is that those three distances in such landscape paintings are an image, a writing of, is precisely meaning itself. The three distances manifest the structure of meaning, without which there would be nothing for us at all. Consider first Ma Yuan's 12th century scroll, dancing and singing, peasants returning from work. My fave. I'm going to put this on the cover of my book. In this painting, the three distances are especially well marked. In the bottom third of the painting, in the near distance, are the singing and dancing peasants returning from work. In the middle distance, one looks up at tree-topped mountains, but can also discern various marks of human habitation. And off to the side, and clearly very far away, are the shadowy outlines of more mountains. The three parts are separated by mist and cloud, and in some aspects by nothing at all, sheer emptiness. To me, this painting is utterly satisfying and deeply moving. But not all paintings in this genre have the three distances. In Fan Kuan's early 11th century Travelers Among Mountains and Streams, for example, the far distance is absent. Below, there are scenes of life, and beyond, towering mountains. But there are no mountains off in the distance, barely discerned. As a result, this landscape is, as I experience it, somewhat claustrophobic. One feels hemmed in, constrained by the wall of rock that occludes what surely exists beyond those mid-level mountains. In Nizan's 14th century landscape, it is instead the middle distance that seems to be absent. Below are again scenes of life, and far away into the distance are misty mountains. There are no towering mountains between the two upon which one might gaze. And as a result, one feels not the sort of claustrophobia that one feels, or at least I feel, when the far distance is absent, but instead a somewhat uncanny stasis. There's no life, no movement here. The landscape as a whole evokes an eerie, death-like stillness. Why? It does not require any great feat of imagination or intellect to interpret the near distance in the lowest part of the painting as marking the space that we actually inhabit, the bit of the world we call home, the familiar and near. In a painting, it is at this distance that one most often finds marks of human life. People doing the sorts of things that people do, various sorts of human habitation, boats on rivers and lakes, bridges, and so on. But one also finds such marks of human life, though not so many, in the middle distance, in the mountains that tower over one. And what this seems to signify, or better emphasize, is that those towering mountains, although not one's home, are somehow accessible to one. They are not a part of one's life world, separated as they are by empty space, but one could come to inhabit such mountains, make them one's home, as clearly others do. The far mountains, by contrast, are not accessible. Indeed, they are, relative to one's life, quite shadowy, not fully real. But they are there, and in their way, they beckon one, which is, at least in part, why it can seem claustrophobic if they are absent. While the middle distance provides a space of possibility within which one might grow and develop, even transform oneself to become what one now is not, which explains why a landscape lacking such a distance seems somehow dead. The far distance provides a frame within which any such change is intelligible at all. Without the enframing provided by the far distance, the mountains in the middle distance cannot reveal possibilities for one, but seem instead continuous with what is, separated merely by mist and cloud, and as such, form a barrier within one's life world beyond which one cannot go. Overall, then, what such paintings seem to reveal or express, those that exhibit all three distances, is that it is within just such a tripartite structure that we live and find meaning. This truth about the shaping of the meaning and significance of the lived world, in virtue of which it is a lived world at all, is thirdness in something like Peirce's sense. When we talk of thirdness, especially in light of the fact that it is given a face for us in three distances of mountains in a literati landscape, we are liable to think of a triad, a collection of three things. But this is not right. A triad is not thirdness. The three in thirdness are not three things, as might be found in a triad, but are instead dimensions or aspects, like the faces of a rock. As one must, according to Wang Wei, show three faces of a rock to express its life, its inner nature, so meaning must be shown to have three faces or facets if it is to be shown as what it is. But the imagery of a rock and its faces can also be misleading, insofar as it can suggest that what is needed is merely alternative views of one and the same thing. The facets of meaning are not faces in this sense. Rather, each is a fundamental and distinctive sort of aspect, something indicated already by the three distances in the case of mountains, distances that are not merely quantitative, a matter of literal distance from the perceiver, as faces of a rock might be. The different distances mark different roles or significances, different features of the structure of our lived world. Not the spatial structure, but the structure of it in its lived significance. In the case of a literati landscape in which the three distances are exhibited, we are presented with mountains, both here and there, home and away, and off in the distance, a shadowy third in framing the whole in a way that articulates the relationship of here and there, home and away. What the farthest mountains serve to convey is that there, the mountains in the middle distance, is not merely another here, only further away. What is there contrasts modally with here, perhaps as where one has been, but is no longer, but also perhaps where one could be, can aspire to be, but is not yet. The mountains in the middle distance are at once there, clearly mountains that are habitable, but also lacking in a way, in not being here, not already a part of one's lived world. It is again those mountains in the middle distance, at least in landscapes in which all three distances are present, that provide room for growth and change, for life. The mountains in the far distance, shrouded in mist and at times barely discernible at all, are hardly mountains at all. They are less things, objects, than they are accents or colorings that give shape and definition to other parts of the whole, without themselves having much in the way of shape and definition. The mountains in the far distance provide in this way a kind of frame relative to which we can grasp the nearer mountains in their relationship one to the other. As yin and yang collapse into a mere duality, two things without any constitutive relationship, absent the third dimension that is their distinctive and internal relationship, So without the far mountains to provide context and perspective, the near and middle mountains are merely two things, two mountains separated by a distance here and there in a merely spatial sense, which again helps to explain the fact that the mountains in the middle distance can appear to bar one's way in landscapes in which the far mountains are missing. The middle mountains in that case in which the far mountains are missing, are in one's world, like a wall that bars one's way, rather than constituting a possibility in relation to one's world. Only in the case in which the three distances are manifested do we discover a space within which to dwell, to make our home. And we can do, I have suggested, because in so expressing space, literati painters reveal the structure of meaning itself, that without which there would be nothing for us, no world at all. We've seen that lyric aesthetic begins with music, because it is with music, organized sound, that we, as the animals we are, naturally resonate. With poetry, such understanding gains a voice, the ability to speak the meaning, significance, and value we find in things. And in lyric painting, through the expressive medium of brush and ink that is first perfected in calligraphy, we learn to write meaning, significance, and value as such, the vitality of things, the vitality even of those things that are not alive, precisely because to be vital is not merely to be alive, though that is the paradigm case. To be vital is to matter, to be intrinsically significant. Both lyric poetry of the Tang and lyric painting of the Song express such vitality. But it is landscapes alone, and if I'm right, only those landscapes manifesting the three distances, that fully realize the aspiration of Chinese lyric aesthetic, the aspiration to grasp the underlying, that which enables any and all meaning, meaning beyond meaning, the essence of meaningfulness itself, what in Chinese is the Tao. But if so, then Chinese lyric aesthetic is a tradition not only of art, as generally conceived, it is a tradition of inquiry, the aim of which is knowledge, in particular knowledge of the fundamental structure of the world, insofar as it is meaningful to us at all. In painting, the scholar artist resonates with, actively mirrors that structure. Why have we hitherto failed to recognize this? Consider first knowing a theorem of pure mathematics. This is not simply a matter of knowing that the theorem is true, simply a matter of possessing that piece of information, nor even is it a matter of knowing that certain sentences stand in the relation of logical consequence, that there is a proof. Knowing a theorem of pure mathematics is knowing its proof in the sense of knowing how to prove it, being able to engage in the chain of reasoning that establishes that it's true, being able actually to prove it, which is, of course, an action one performs. And yet mathematical knowledge, some of it at least, is, if anything is, theoretical rather than practical knowledge. The content is theoretical, even if the knowing, the act, is in its way practical, a matter of doing rather than of being. So it is in the case of certain sorts of literati landscape paintings. Being able, as a result of years of practice, training, and study to write certain sorts of landscapes is quite like being able, again, as a result of years of practice, training, and study, to draw certain sorts of inferences, to engage in the chains of reasoning that constitute knowledge of mathematical theorems. We tend to think that knowing, insofar as it is an act, a matter of knowing how to do something, must be a knowing of something that is for something, that it cannot be valuable for its own sake. And correspondingly, we tend to think that if what one knows is intrinsically valuable, then it must be intelligible, independent of any act by which one knows that one's knowing of it must be a state rather than something one does. Both are mistaken. We can understand why we make these mistakes by appeal to the idea with which we began. The idea that the act of speaking is peculiar as an act insofar as it has a content that can seem from one perspective, that which is speaker focused, to be inextricably tied to the act, and from another, that which is content focused, to be already separate, to be altogether separable from the act. The fact is, the content of the act of speaking is neither inseparable, as assumed by the Chinese thinker, nor separable, as the Indo-European thinker assumes. It is instead repeatable. It is separable from this or that act of speaking, but not from the act of speaking as such. And knowledge, similarly, is neither exhausted in the act of knowing, nor wholly separable from it. We think otherwise and so confuse the ways in which knowing might be conceived to be practical and or theoretical, which in turn blinds us to the ways in which the practice of Chinese lyric painting can be theoretical, precisely because in focusing either on the act of speaking or on the content, we fail to understand the repeatability, not only of speech, but also of knowledge. What the repeatability of knowing shows is that knowing can be at once active, so practical in a sense, a matter of doing, and have a content that is of intrinsic value, that is purely theoretical. The Chinese lyric tradition is, as Cao suggests, something that happened. Something that had a beginning in the Warring States music, a middle in Tang poetry, and an end in certain sorts of song landscape paintings. This happening, I have argued, has the shape of a course of inquiry, and indeed a course of inquiry into what an Indo-European thinker might describe as the true nature of reality, said by an Indo-European thinker, or at least one aspect of it. As I've further indicated, I believe that the lyric tradition has been wholly successful in this. The work of the Chinese lyric tradition positions us as never before to understand the essential nature and structure of the meaning in virtue of which there is anything for us at all. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And now we have some time to take questions. As usual, I'm going to do my best to moderate between those in the room and those online, try to establish a queue alternating back and forth if indeed there are people who wish to enter both queues. So I'm looking around the room here. Oh, I see. Sorry. I thought you were pointing to my screen as if there was somebody in the chat that I'd missed. Okay, so we have Alan first. Why don't you get us started?
Painting and then to the whole idea of inquiry and knowledge. So let me, I have a few comments and then some questions as well. Okay, back to lyric poetry. I think you're right to talk about some the early poetry, like as oral, like the act of speaking. But I would like to say that if you look at the classical Chinese poetry, I think that we have two types of poetry. And one is you start something you said, which is more close to what we call folk lyrics, and which is meant to be chanted and sung, and either with music or without. So in that case, you're right. The act of speaking is very important. Talk about the rhythm, the rhyme, and and also part of the music tone, things like that. But then, of course, eventually, and we develop what we called literary poetry, and which is really focused on not just the speaking but the writing, particularly with Chinese character. Chinese character is what we call ideographic rather than phonetic like your Indo-European language. So in that sense, also the character, the written one, also evoked special images, which is supposed to be comprehended to looking for meaning. And also when you shift to painting, and in painting then is also the painting you show is all what we call the literary painting. So here we see, and in Chinese we call the unity between poetry and painting. 诗画合一 is the one thing, and this is very kind of a literary tradition. But here, I think you mentioned something I think very interesting. Talk about, you say the act of speaking in the lyrics more important than the content itself. So here come to my question. And yeah, in some cases, right. But I think part of the reason maybe has something to do with the nature, the differences of the nature of poetry between the Chinese and the Western. In the classical early Western tradition, poetry, like you have like a epics, like Homer's epic, and they meant to be like a storytelling. Is a narrative in nature, but the early Chinese poetry we don't even have the epic tradition. It's all like a short poetry for emotional expression. So we say that Chinese tend to say ours tend to be more expressive vis-a-vis the one which are more representative, like in the Western tradition, imitative. Aristotelian talk about imitation poetry, but for Chinese more emotion oriented. Because I don't know if that's part of the reason that for Chinese, then the way how you express yourself, the speaker tend to be more important rather than the story itself. Because in the case of Homer, of course maybe Homer is important, but nobody really cared too much about Homer, but they really talk about the story themselves. So that's my first question. And then back to let me see here, and also back to the paintings here. You give some painting like after Song Dynasty, and I call them literary paintings, and they were quite influenced by Taoism or maybe Zen Buddhism. And you talk about space and distance, and of course, and to me, they're more like a kind of a representation of the Zhuangzi here. Taoist influence Zhuangzi notion of what we call this kind of a like a far away free wanderings, like wandering in the other world. So it's kind of a Chinese notion or literary tradition of transcendence, transcendence. Kind of like but transcendent in terms of nature rather than the divine, like heaven, something like that. So you see this kind of nature centered versus human centered. So it's kind of like a transcendent from the human world. It's sort of like kind of a hermit tradition in China, something like that. But back to again, very interesting the idea you talk about it, to do something here, to do something with lyric poem, or to do something with painting. And say like even painting, Chinese call painting as moving meditation. I mean, apart from the knowledge part, at least it's not just painting, it's act of painting, it's act of doing meditation, because the qi, the vital qi, plays very important role here when somebody tries to paint like rivers or mountains, whatever. So, but I do agree with this notion of trying to focus this idea of practice, acting, to do something with words, to do something with pictures, with paintings, and the whole idea here, which might, as you said, give you another alternative of way looking at the so-called aesthetic experience, not just in terms of theory, it's also part of practice. Yeah, but I do not agree with, I don't know, the one that Mr. Gao, that you cited here, for the Confucian tradition, particularly dealing with the poetry, to do something for Confucianism is more like to moralize. to moralize the aesthetic experience. For example, Confucius gave comments of the early Chinese poetry, and he really did what we call the cherry picking. He liked some poetry and hate the other, and the one he hated and he called corrupted, that's also folk lyric, and they're very popular. But for Confucius, because they are erotic poetry, so they're no good. They are morally corrupted. And so the moral implications play a very important role in the whole Confucian aesthetic theory. Vis-a-vis Taoism, they really talk about the experience per se is amoral. And, you know, aesthetics is an amoral experience, you should not be moralized, particularly for Zhuangzi, you should not be moralized. But in a word, I mean, Jasmine, I really agree with your observation. I think will be something really interesting, particularly talk about Xuanxue, profound learning theories. And those are a bunch of scholars. They're all they're poets, and they're famous poets and famous painters combined with famous musicians. So I think it would be really great to study those particular tradition in China. Again, they are very Taoistic. They're also what we call new Taoists. And so maybe I think to link the two will be easier for you to see the connection between Chinese philosophy and Chinese aesthetic theory. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you. That is a wonderful set of comments. I don't think I'm going to be able to speak to everything, but let me say something about the relationship. I think this was a theme that is coming through this, between the early claim about the focus on the speaker and the act of speaking and taking the content to be inextricably tied to the act, versus the Indo-European tradition, which takes the content to be separable. And as you say, I think that's really connected to the fact that Chinese poetry is more expressive and Western tends to be narrative and representational. I'm not claiming, I mean, it's interesting. It's a sort of Hegelian in itself, for itself. All of us do both of these things. All of us sometimes speak in a way that the content is supposed to be really completely tied up with the act. We can also speak in a way where the content is supposed to be completely separable. So these are things that we all as speakers can do, but there's differences in sort of the cultural understanding of what we're doing when we're speaking. So in the West, it's a very strong cultural assumption that the content of a speech act is separate from the speaking. And this just runs through all of the theory. We're learning that it's not true, but that's the picture of language that you get in an Indo-European language like English. The picture you get of language in Chinese is that the content is exhausted in the act. So, I mean, I agree with you, particularly when they're writing poems. I mean, as I said, this is all tied with, certainly in painting it's tied up with calligraphy, but already with the poem. I mean, you've got this grid. A grid is a visual thing. It's, 5 across and 8 down, and you're putting characters. It's a very visual object. But the self-understanding of the poets is very often that the poem is exhausted in the act of poetizing. I mean, I can't even say this in English, right? In English, you make a poem, you produce something that is a poem. In Chinese, you don't do that. You enact a poem. So there is a tension there. I agree with you. And it's also non-trivial that I'm an Indo-European thinker thinking about the contents of the paintings in particular. So I'm sort of saying, look, there was something that happened here that people haven't noticed. And I'm particularly also looking at these as a philosopher, and not really as a philosopher of art or of aesthetics, right? I'm looking as, I guess, I don't know, a metaphysician. And that's not the only way to look at these paintings. So I'm looking at this development that, as I'm suggesting, I don't think other people have seen this. And I don't think it's a natural thing that you would see coming out of the Chinese tradition. Again, because of the focus on the activity. So yes, I agree with you. These things were being produced and they were clearly, the content was clearly separable from the act. But I think still in the self-understanding, very much, if you read the literature on these things, it's very much about, because to be sage-like is to be able to paint in a way that is resonant with nature. And it's the painting that, the act of painting, that is the crucial thing, not the product that is produced. The product is just the trace of the act. So I agree with you. It's quite complicated. It's subtle and complicated. There are many dimensions to it. But I think, both. Yes, I want to focus on that content, and it's something that I think is less in focus for the overall Chinese understanding. I bringing in more of Zhuangzi on tree wandering, that just seems, that's wonderful, because that is part of that resonance and mirroring that you're at home in nature. And what I'm suggesting is one of the things that is coming out for someone who is so deeply and in some sense purely at home in nature is something we can recognize as the structure of meaning in the world within which we are at home, because it has meaning. So yeah, I think that seems really important. And of course, I'm so much more focused on Zhuangzi than on Confucius. That it's really Zhuangzi who is feeding this lyric aesthetic tradition. There's also an important influence of Buddhism that I haven't talked about at all, that I think, and your mention of profound learning reminded me of this, because they were heavily influenced. So I mean, this is just an incredibly rich tradition, and yeah, so much to say. I think you're raising all the right things about what the next 20 pages. So thank you very much.
Can I add quickly about painting? So here all the example you give like a behind, vertically, but most Chinese painting also like supposed to be horizontally. Yeah. And also here I want to also mention the act of looking. Because Chinese is scroll painting, it's not like a Western oil painting. You hang, and you look at the whole piece, At the same time, Chinese is close the scroll and you open it. Say, I show you painting, I won't show you everything. I open it bit by bit with a movement. So you see things bit by bit. And of course here, and in the Chinese painting, it is, the reason can be because it's decentering, there's no center point. Like oil painting, you have really structure, you see the central point, the whole perspective. And Chinese give you multi-perspective. So you see, the mountain and the pavilion and a little bit of rock and then a fish pond, and each by the whole experience of looking at the painting also is kind of a procedure rather than the final product. That also fit into exactly what you said earlier.
At any rate. So this comes from Luke. Luke writes, I am curious about your remarks regarding calligraphy, that the characters have no meaning when communicated through that medium of calligraphy. Is it the case that characters take on a new meaning entirely when represented by calligraphy as art?
I hope I'm not wrong about this. My understanding about calligraphy is it's very important that the characters have, that they're real characters. There's a contemporary painter who I can't remember his name offhand, but he has made up characters that really have no meaning, and has made all these fabulous works. He has, books that are written in these characters that have no meaning. That's not calligraphy, because they aren't real characters. Calligraphy requires that they're real characters, and therefore that they do have meaning. But, and I think there's a little bit of tension, disagreement here, but on the whole, my sense is you don't have to worry at all about the meanings of the characters when you're doing calligraphy. The calligraphy is all about the brush strokes and the movement of the brush given the shape of the character, not given what it means. So that, if there's anybody who's an expert on calligraphy, I would love to know what they think, but that's my understanding, is they do have to be characters, they have to have meaning, but the meanings that they have are not relevant to the artistic value of the calligraphy. Is that?
Is there anyone else? Please.
One of the points that of my concern is about intersubjectivity, because this kind of old lyric aesthetic is quite limited in the in certain social class of the governors probably, and there are certain activities for them to like making these lyrics on their own, and on that particular activities, and many of these pieces, especially the lyrics, are created under that circumstance. And actually, I think they probably follow certain paradigm, so can they like understand each other, and also it's very progressive, just as Alan has mentioned. When we are looking into all the drawings, we are going to follow the orders instead of as a whole. So I think my concern is quite kind of Hegelian, right? That each subject is kind of doing sort of sublation of all these scenarios with their emotional feelings, right? So just these are just my very rough ideas, and I think it can be can be discussed in your theories. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so let me see if I'm clear on the concern. So you've got this, I mean, it is very much a particular class, right? I mean, it's the literary class, and they're highly educated.
Yeah.
They've spent years turning themselves into the kind of people who can do this kind of work. Now, you might see that as a good thing. They're highly skilled. They really have transformed themselves, learned to be human. Or you could see it as they've heavily suppressed themselves and misshapen themselves. And certainly coming out of Zhuangzi, the hope is, and this is I mean, I think now that you're right, there is a really interesting tension here, because in somebody like Zhuangzi, I mean, he's very against the tradition, acculturation, but he also recognizes that you have to engage in a course of a kind of study and practice to still your mind. And in the larger version of this, I do talk about emotions versus feelings, and how we need to think about how those get separated, because you can only be free, you can only engage in the kind of free and easy wandering that we were talking about before, if somehow your emotions have been purified. and they belong to you in some distinctive way that I think our feelings don't belong to us, right? Our feelings just happen. They you know, they push us around. So I think you're right. A story needs to be told about how that training and that intensive social structure that is behind all of this is actually freeing rather than limiting and crippling. I think we could say the same about the study of philosophy. Is your philosophical education actually breaking you out of fetters that are binding you, or is it just putting more fetters on you? And we want it to be the case that it's freeing you, right? It's enabling you to think for yourself. I think what this is about, in the best version of what it is about freeing you to really resonate with the world in a way that is in a way distinctive to you, right? It's your painting, it's your mirroring, but it's not just accidentally you. It's not, it's really in some way authentically you. And there I think we really would have to talk about the difference between feelings and emotions, and what purifying and stilling the mind involves. Does that speak to what you were?
Yeah. That's crystal. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you for the great lecture, and I just really like how you highlight on the theoretical knowledge, the notion of theoretical knowledge in traditional Chinese poems, and I've learned that it's easy to write poems in a beautiful or skillful way, but only the meaningful ones are will get appreciated and appraised by people even after hundreds or thousands of years, like by our generation as well. And the meaning of those famous traditional Greek poems is actually, from my perspective, generated, supported, embedded, and intertwined by deeply reflective philosophical thinkings done by the traditional Chinese poets. And they touch on a lot of topics, like what is the meaning of life and political philosophy, the nature of reality, meaning of love, etc. And there's no one traditional famous poem that does not carry with it philosophical importance. And every great traditional Chinese poet, at least from my perspective, is a great philosopher, who expresses and communicates his own unique perspective of the world to the others throughout the creation and throughout the sharing of his poems with other people. I just really like your speech. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's really interesting to think about the poems that that last, right? The ones that keep speaking to us, keep resonating with us. And as you say, they have some kind of philosophical, they seem to have some kind of philosophical significance. And yet it's so interesting because I think this teaches us maybe something about what philosophy is. I mean, if you take a poem, I like thinking about Dupu's Spring Scenes, because it's about a war, it's about the difficulties in communicating. You have to actually read a lot to figure out, you have to know about the Anshan rebellion and so on. So in some way you think, how can this be so meaningful to me? And yet it's talking about the kind of loss that war brings, and the separation of us from nature that war brings. So it's philosophical, but it's also deeply tied to the kinds of beings that we are. And so sometimes, I mean, I was almost surprised when you said, that there's so much philosophy there. There's so much humanity there. And of course, philosophy is really in the end, I think, about us. And, I've done lots of, philosophy and mathematics. In the end, it's still about us. And I think that's what you're bringing out.
Yeah, and I was like reading Nietzsche's poems, like the collection of Nietzsche's poems, and I just realized like how meaningful like the philosophical thinkings are embedded in Nietzsche's poems, and it just like reminds me of how I felt when I was reading traditional Chinese philosophy poems as well. Yeah, I like.
Thank you.
We find ourselves with a few minutes in case there's something. Yeah, please. Yeah, thank you for passing the mic.
Oh, thank you, Professor. I want to ask what you think the different views of literature and art in Chinese and European. Because unlike the things Laocoon, I feel the Chinese art tradition is not like the European art tradition, because European art tradition subdivides different art into poetry, painting, or sculpture. But I think the Chinese tradition art has a big literary tradition. That means the literature always have important states in the art in art. The poetry or painting, music, they all of them have literary metaphors which need to reflect the certain emotions or ideas. I think the tradition is from the Book of Songs, 诗经, and the poetry need to reflect the sentiment, and the scene need to find what we want to do, what we desired. They always united, and later poetry is unified in the government institution, 乐府 in Han Dynasty. And I think the literature, it has some more important states than other art. I think this is a traditional Chinese art. So I want to ask what you think the different views of the art and the literature. Yes, thank you.
This is another very interesting question, and I am no expert in art generally, and so I'm coming at this quite idiosyncratically. However, I do think that the initial hypothesis about how we speak and hear speech helps to explain this kind of phenomenon, because I think in the West, in the Indo-European tradition, when you say art, you think of painting primarily. Like literature, you say art and literature, whereas I think you're right that in the Chinese tradition, literature is central. I mean, they talk about writing paintings. You don't paint paintings, you write them, and that's really significant. And this goes back to the poems and the paintings, how closely connected they were, that you raised, that I didn't say anything about. So it seems to me you're right that. So what kind of sensibility would be a sensibility for whom the verbal, but even more the writing? And I do think, another thing that I want to explain is why Chinese writing is the way, I mean, why that fundamental difference between Chinese character writing and Indo-European writing. These are connected to the ways of speaking and hearing. I think these are deep, deep differences that Chinese characters are fundamental to Chinese thinking. And that is connected to the centrality of literature, because you're talking about, and this is, again, this is a knowledge tradition, because characters are getting at what things are. And when you really understand, you are resonating with the reality of things. And this is the Chinese tradition. Whereas in the West, you put things that are on arm's length, right? You separate yourself from them. You don't resonate with them. You make claims about them. So I think that the visual sense in the West is very strong, whereas it's hearing and therefore music and poetry in China. So, as people sometimes point out, the word for sage, saying, has the ear, the character for the ear as part of the character. So yeah, the expressiveness of language in expressing who we are, that's how we express ourselves to each other, that is absolutely fundamental in China. And that I think is being reflected in exactly the things that you were talking about. Whereas in the West, it's not, I mean, it's so interesting. The focus is not you with other people, it's you and the world. And you forget how important other people are to who you are. So I think that visual focus, and therefore and the representation, that all goes with the separation of the assumption that content is completely separate. So I think what you're picking up, I would want to explain it by this basic hypothesis that I have. I mean, I think anybody who works on both Chinese and Indo-European traditions has to have some kind of view about what the difference is and sort of where it starts. And what I'm suggesting is it starts with the most fundamental thing. I mean, I'm coming out of a Salarzian tradition that says, we become human beings when we learn language. But what I'm saying is there's two ways to be oriented to language, two essentially different ways. Europe went one way, China went the other. Indo-European language becomes the language of mathematics. Chinese language becomes the language of lyric. And these are two deep possibilities. And this is why art doesn't really matter in the West. Mathematics that matters. But that's connected to the language. And I want to say, we're missing that Chinese gives you lyric. And that's the sense in which the words, the meanings of words are not tools. They don't function as tools, they function as material. Western language, the words function as material. You can't write lyric poetry in English. You just can't do it. The language won't let you. You can do mathematics more easily. So actually in my book, I have a chapter on Chinese mathematics, which is very interesting, the way it gets shaped by this sensibility. So yeah, the differences, those are really real. And I'm going to say that's just more evidence of this difference that I'm identifying as the explanatory difference for the two cultures.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody online.